Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin. We've all spent the last week or more watching what's going on in Minneapolis and other parts of our country. We watched utter lawlessness by the Democrats and their militia, and we've also watched a massive propaganda campaign aimed at destroying law enforcement, this case ICE and the Border Patrol, and our ability to remove criminals from our country. This is an intentional attempt by the Democrat Party to keep in this country all the people they brought into this country illegally. But I want to go through this step by step for a moment. Mr. Alex Preddy, who was killed, unfortunately, but the media have tried to turn him into a martyr. They do this all the time. But of course, all the people that have been murdered, raped, and so forth, assaulted by illegal aliens, they don't even know their names. So let's go through this point by point together. Number one, do not arm yourself with a gun and ammunition, extra ammunition, when going to any protest, let alone a protest organized by violent communist socialist groups using signal and encrypted communications, where you know the goal is to confront and obstruct federal law enforcement, which is a crime, by the way, from carrying out their lawful duties and the lawful orders. You can protest, but you cannot interfere. That's not a First Amendment right, period. And we know these groups, we know who they are now, thanks to Fox News Digital, and most of the rest of the media is ignoring it. They want you to think this is spontaneous, this is coming out of their neighborhoods. It's not. This is not a Second Amendment issue. You have the right to carry your weapon if you have a permit and an ID and other requirements of your state. Like you have the right to drive your car with a driver's license, but how you conduct yourself with a gun or a car matters. Number two, do not interfere with law enforcement when you know the situation is dangerous and can easily escalate if you attempt to obstruct them. In fact, doing so is a crime. It has nothing to do with free speech or freedom to assemble, period. Number three, when federal law enforcement is attempting to arrest an illegal alien who's committed violent and in some cases heinous additional crimes, do not interfere with or otherwise obstruct law enforcement from apprehending such fugitives. Again, this is a federal offense. Moreover, you might get harmed, you'll likely get arrested, and you might get killed. Number four, American citizens have a right to live in safe and secure neighborhoods. They have a right to expect local, state, federal law enforcement, in the case of illegal aliens, to protect them. And that includes removing these individuals from their communities. When governors and mayors order state and local law enforcement to stand down, they are protecting criminal illegal aliens, not the citizenry. And they are creating a very hostile living environment. The political demagoguery, in addition, and the unhinged, full-throated gaslighting, like by DAs from Philadelphia, that guy is a nut, and he is vile. Talking about hunting down ICE agents, that guy needs to be examined. And also politicians of the same mindset. This is toxic. It's intended to be toxic. It's intended to be provocative. Number five, federal immigration law sets forth scores of bases for apprehending, detaining, and deporting illegal aliens. These laws have been on the books for decades, passed by Democrats and Republicans. In fact, a foreign individual has to come to the United States legally, and if he or she doesn't, that is enough to deport them. That's the law. It's been the law. It's been the law since the beginning. Number six, sanctuary states and cities are unconstitutional states and cities. They're violating the federal Constitution. They cannot declare their independence from the United States and our Constitution and federal law on any issue, let alone immigration. Imagine if you're in a conservative state and they say, you know what, we're a sanctuary city or state for the Second Amendment. We're not going to abide by any of those laws. Of course that's absurd. That's a throwback to the Democrats of the Confederacy. We fought a whole civil war on that. But that's in the tradition of the Democrat Party, is it not? This is not a federalism issue. The federal government has plenary, meaning wide power to make immigration decisions. That's not only what the Constitution compels, that's what the Supreme Court has said over and over and over again. So it is these Democrat mayors and these Democrat governors who are violating their oaths, violating the federal Constitution, and violating law. There is no such constitutional thing as a sanctuary city or state. Otherwise, states are now free to pick whatever subjects they want to comply with or not. The Democrat Party is fueling this latest assault on the federal Constitution and the rule of law. They waved in millions and millions of illegal aliens in violation of a federal Constitution's requirement to ensure that our laws are faithfully executed. And in this case, the Supremacy Clause. They bulldozed through one federal immigration law and rule after another to pave the path for massive illegal immigration. They seek to increase Democrat Party representation through the census, which still counts illegal aliens for purposes of apportioning congressional seats and the Electoral College votes. That's all they're about. They want power at all costs. Now, for the Democrat Party, preventing the deportation of illegal aliens, all of them, is the second part of their two-part strategy. First, open borders, then end deportations. This is a revolution by immigration, as I've been saying over and over again. It is essential that they weaken, that they diminish, that they smear ICE, that they defund or slash the spending on ICE, and undermine all parts of our immigration infrastructure, which they've been doing. For the Democrat Party, the party is more important than the country. The party is the key, not the country for them, which is why you see this fusion of the party with the socialists and the communist organizations that are behind these violent confrontations with ICE. But the media, most of it, is censoring it. It's all out there. All the receipts, all the gaslighting. To put a fine point on it, for the Democrats, party power before country. Just like in California, party power before state. That's the way it is. Now, of course, the Democrat Party threatens to fire the DHS secretary, who now they want to impeach, and the president, too. That's all they do. Spend, tax, regulate, borrow, and impeach. That's all they do. And they will blame it all on the Republicans. The Republicans actually shut down the government, even though we voted to shut down the government. And shame on those Republicans, like Tillis and others, who are joining the chorus, demanding surrender in the face of all this, given all that's at stake. Let's go through a few more facts here. I looked it up. Department of Homeland Security. Let's look at customs. What percentage of the customs workforce do you think, enforcement and custom workforce, is minority? 31.13% is Latino. Only 51% is quote-unquote white. I don't like these color designations because the left uses them and the government uses them, but you got to play along in order to spell this out. Now, what about the Border Patrol? 50.93% are Hispanic. Got that? The minority is the majority. So this isn't white racism or the white system or the white establishment. And by the way, I noticed in Minnesota, I didn't see a lot of minorities attacking ICE, involved in those violent, riotous protests. Did you? No, I see a lot of white people, just for the record. Now, let's talk about what the Democrats are up to with some specificity. A year ago, there was a great piece by Peter Kirsanow in National Review, and he's citing the statistics from the Center for Immigration Studies. He says the net effect of increased both legal and illegal immigration in the 2020 census shifted 17 House seats and 17 Electoral College votes, resulting in a net gain of 14 seats in blue states, 10 seats shifting from red states, and 4 from battleground states to Democrats. That Democrat net gain is greater than the respective electoral votes of all but 10 states, in part because districts with high percentages of non-citizens tend to vote Democrat. Of the 24 districts where 1 in 5 adults is not an American citizen, 20 were won by Democrats in 2022. In contrast, the Democrats won in just 5 of the 54 districts where 98% of the adults were citizens. So where there's mostly citizens, the Republicans usually win. Where there's a large number of illegal immigrants, the Democrats almost always win. Millions of illegal aliens have flooded the country during the Biden presidency, an indeterminate number, estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands, have been flown into the country by the Biden administration and deposited in certain specific jurisdictions. Increasingly, the Democrats needn't be concerned about persuading American voters. They've gained electoral votes by the addition, strategic and otherwise, of illegal immigrants. This is what this is all about. This is why they're going to shut down the government. This is why they're pushing their militia to be more and more violent and confrontational. Because now we're talking about only get rid of the most violent criminals, not the other people. Oh, you're going to go to Home Depot? You're going to go, well, where are they? They're at Home Depot. They're at these other places. No, you can't do that. We even have some Republicans, I'm not going to embarrass them, are saying, we need to have a national discussion. The American people don't really want all these people deported. Really? Well, the latest poll by CNN and everybody else says they do. And sometimes you do what the law requires, period. So if we're going to now backpedal on this, what does that mean? It means the Democrat Party, which is the umbrella organization for these Marxist, Islamist, illegal alien organizations, and these homegrown militia pushed by the city mayors and the state governors, we're going to see more of it. We're going to see more of it. I want to talk about federal law when these so-called protesters are not really protesting and exercising their First Amendment right, where they're stepping over the line. Conspiracy to obstruct federal law enforcement, that is a federal crime, typically under 18 U.S.C. Section 371 or 372. Two or more people agreeing to impede, injure, or interfere with fellow officers. That's that. The elements, the government must prove 1, an agreement existed, 2, the defendant voluntarily joined it, and 3, an overt act was committed to further the conspiracy. Well, that's clearly taken place. They've got the signal and the encrypted communications. This is all organized. It's funded. There's a billionaire in China that's involved in it. You've got all kinds of organizations. This isn't spontaneous. Not in the least. Now, the penalties under 371, conspirators can be fined and imprisoned for up to 5 years. If the conspiracy involves interfering with a federal officer's safety or duties, like biting off his finger. That happened last week. Under 372, penalties can reach 6 years. Now, assaulting or resisting or impeding certain officers or employees doesn't have to be conspiracy. It could be one person. We have 18 U.S.C. Section 111. Forcibly assaults, resists, opposes, impedes, intimidates, or interferes with any person designated in Section 1114, that would include ICE, while engaged in or on account of the performance of official duties, or forcibly assaults or intimidates any person who formerly served under the section of the federal code. So clearly, individuals who are obstructing federal law enforcement, ICE, from carrying out their lawful orders are committing federal offenses. Now, what are the penalties for this? Imprisonment of not more than 3 years, as well as financial penalties, or both. These are serious offenses. Now, what about spitting on a federal officer? We saw that Alex Preddy had done that in his first run-in, violent run-in with ICE and federal officials. Let's take another look at this. It does fall under assault with physical contact. It involves contact with bodily fluids. So simple assault can lead to up to 1 year in federal prison, while more severe offenses or those resulting in bodily harm can carry additional monetary penalties, but up to 8 years. And the statute covers any federal employee, including agents for ICE, Border Patrol, FBI, and so forth and so on. Well, we saw that Preddy had done that in his first go-round, and what did they do? He spat on an officer, he kicked out the light, he was tackled, and he was released. And he had his gun, I believe. 18 U.S.C. 1361, damage to government property, federal property. Did he break the light? It is a felony, often resulting in heavy fines up to 10 years in prison if the damage is over $1,000. If the damage is $1,000 and less, it is a misdemeanor punishable by up to 1 year in prison. So we're talking about real crimes that are being committed, real crimes. But I want to go on a little bit more here. What about the crimes committed against the American people? Why do we have ICE? Why are they trying to enforce the law? Why is the president so focused on this? Here's why. Let me give you the crime statistics in 2024, the last year of the Biden regime and his auto pen. ICE arrests with criminal histories. In 2024, ICE enforcement and removal operation arrested 81,312 non-citizens with criminal convictions or pending charges, which accounted for over 71% of their total arrests. These 81,312 individuals had a combined total of 516,000 charges and/or convictions, including over 57,000 assaults, over 18,000 sex offenses, and nearly 3,000 homicides. Have you heard the Democrats or their media talk about any of this? Of course not. They want to create martyrs out of this individual or that individual for the purpose of maintaining power, growing power, attacking DHS, attacking ICE, attacking NOM, attacking Trump. Non-detained docket as of July 2024, there are over 425,000 non-citizens with criminal convictions on ICE's non-detained docket, a database of people facing deportation but not in ICE custody. That's who they're looking for. In FY 2024, 21,304 non-U.S. citizens were sentenced in the federal system, with almost 90% of them being illegal aliens. And by the way, the figures represent individuals identified by federal law enforcement, primarily at the border during interior enforcement. They don't include tens of thousands or perhaps hundreds of thousands of others. Now, how did we get here? The Democrat Party put us here. They opened the borders. They violated our immigration laws in violation of the federal Constitution. The Supremacy Clause and the requirement that Biden and his administration faithfully execute the laws. Quote, faithfully execute. It's in the Constitution. What did they do? They terminated the Remain in Mexico policy, number one. Number two, Title 42 public health order. The Biden administration announced its plans to end the use of the expulsion authority under Title 42, despite warnings from DHS that the number of aliens who would seek to enter the United States would more than double. And it did more than that. So people, perhaps with COVID-19, were pouring over the border. Number three, mass parole. Parole is supposed to be one individual at a time. You're supposed to look at their circumstances. You're supposed to look at whether or not they have a right to parole under the definition of parole under federal law. They would let in mass numbers of people under parole if they were from a particular country or region of a country in violation of the parole rules. What else did they do? Credible fear reform. Among the most concerning aspects of the rule, its provisions that they put in place, they allowed asylum officers, bureaucrats, to grant a path to citizenship if that asylum officer on his or her own decided that to send this person back may not be in the best interest of that person. That person might be harmed or something like that. They just did it on their own. You know what that is? Massive backdoor amnesty. What else did they do? Non-enforcement policies. They didn't enforce most of the policies that applied, or they watered them down to allow as many people in as possible. Alternatives to detention. They massively expanded that. So you had people who were supposed to be detained who were not detained, and they gave them work permits. A public charge. Biden administration published a new public charge regulation to govern how DHS will administer the public charge ground of inadmissibility. Inadmissibility into the country if you're going to be on welfare or something like that. They watered it down. And they put many of those people on welfare, and they put many of those people on Medicaid. And we have temporary protected status. You're temporarily protected from leaving the country, but they never ended it. It was never temporary. They created this circumstance to empower their party. They are power hungry. They will shut down the government because they don't care about the country. It's the party. This is a massive power grab. That's what you're seeing in Minneapolis. That's what you're seeing with these radical left organizations, and the Democrat Party has embraced them all.
Click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You won't get it anywhere else.